Okay, welcome everybody. So this is a Tyfu Cymru hosted webinar for commercial growers in Wales. It's our second one with Ben, and we first met Ben in January when he came over to speak at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and we were actually approached by his publisher to see whether we wanted to host an event in South Wales. We jumped at the chance, and Tom and the guys at Kaitan agreed to host, and they were fantastic hosts, and we had a really enjoyable and informative event. So when Ben returned home to the States, we wanted to try and continue that relationship and learn from his expertise. So we set up the first webinar at the beginning of April, which many of you might have joined, and this is now the second one. We're a demand-led program, so we really are guided by our growers as to what they want on, and we had a specific request from some to look at composting and no-till. So welcome, Ben, and thank you for continuing to work with us, and I will hand over now.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. I remember my time in Wales almost on a daily basis, and in part because my kids love looking at the little picture book I put together of my trip, but I feel like I left a part of myself in Wales. It's just such a beautiful place, and I've forged really deep connections and people relationships. There's something about the culture in Wales that I feel like it's my spiritual home in some ways. So this is wonderful to be able to connect, even though it's through thousands of miles and over this digital medium. I wanted to focus today on making compost in the first half, and in the second half on how do we use that compost in a no-till soil building method. And I'll show you what we're doing here. And I convinced some farmer friends of mine to send me some images. You can see what other farmers in the U.S. are doing. No-till has really taken off as a movement here, especially among smaller scale farms, but even larger scale operations are starting to find some methods to make it work. Okay, and so first, a couple of places for more resources. You can go to claybottomfarm.com, my webpage. There are some of these slides that I'm sharing here will be on that webpage and some more information. I offer a couple of courses, and then these two books talk about some of the methods that I'll be going over here. I'd like to begin with a bit of an introduction. For those of you in the last session, I shared, I think, about how I was transplanting about 600 tomato plants for restaurants. And our farm is essentially a behind-the-scenes farm for 6 high-end chefs, high-end restaurants. And what I do is meet with those chefs in the wintertime, take orders from them, and plant food that we deliver throughout the growing season to the restaurants. Well, there was one afternoon where Rachel was in the house listening to the news, and the governor of Indiana came on the radio and said, we need to close all the restaurants in Indiana. And I'm an aloof farmer. I don't pay attention to the news as much as I should. Rachel ran out to the greenhouse and she said, hey, you need to stop planting tomatoes. They just closed all your restaurants. I said, oh, come on. Almost didn't believe it. And so I called my chefs and a couple of my chefs, and they confirmed the bad news. And so we thought, oh crap, we've got a lot of food in the ground. We need to figure out what to do with it. And so what we did was we called some potential customers in our community, and we said, hey, we've got all this food, all these tomatoes in particular, we planted for restaurants, and how can we get it out? And what we heard was they want no contact to your door delivery. And so we're doing that once a week. Delivering food directly to doors. People put coolers out in front of their houses, and we're delivering food to them. And I share that story just to say that the lean system, which is a system born in Japan, which is focused on listening to your customers. And you start with the customer and you work backwards from there. And really everything else about the lean system is particular to your unique situation. And really you want to deliver value to your customer and then cut out waste from your value stream. Anything that's not directly contributing value for a customer, you should get rid of that practice. So try to keep that concept in mind, and I'll refer back to that lean concept. You contribute value to your customer and cut out any type of waste, which is defined as any practice not directly in service of adding value for a customer from your process. And because that has guided our thinking in terms of making compost, we wanted to lean up that process, and in terms of no-till soil building too. And so I'll go deeper in that in a minute. So lean system, rooting out waste, increase your efficiency and profits with less work. And really, my mentor, farming-wise, is George Washington Carver, a black farmer from Louisiana, said, turn waste into useful channels, should be the slogan of every farmer. And there's a lot of waste on farms, good waste and bad waste. A lot of waste can be reused and turned into useful channels, as George Washington Carver preached. And so we've tried to graft that way of thinking onto our tiny operation to make sure every square inch is used and make sure that it has the right crop in it and grown at the right season, and that it's ideally pre-sold. We try to sell our crops before we even buy the seeds, so that none of our efforts are wasted, so that every hour counts. And if you want to go deeper in this, there are the 7 types of waste in the lean production system. And as we, so I'll refer to different types of mudas. I sometimes slip into that language. A muda would be the Japanese term for waste, as I talk about our composting and soil building methods. We're a 4-season farm. I'm in my 15th year of doing this. About 8 to 9 years, 8.5 years doing it as a full-time living. Having quit, I had worked in the school system and did some construction work, and I wrote some articles too. And we have 3 part-time staff people who work with us. And we have this crazy local commitment where all of our food ends up within 1.5 miles of our farm. Of course, that lets us stay on the farm so we can devote most of our time to growing food and very little time to delivering food. But it also forces us to really listen deeply to our local community here, because we're really interdependent on them to make sure that the food we grow gets eaten. And like I said, behind the scenes, Farmers 6 Hours in Restaurants, we do have a small booth at our farmers market. Not sure if that market's going to stay open, or we're not sure exactly what's up on that. And then we sell to a food co-op, it's a small grocery store here too. And you can see how we've tried to apply lean thinking. In particular, our soil preparation methods have allowed us to shave a lot of hours off our work. We had easily worked more than 60 hours a week down to 35, 5 acres to half an acre, and 60 or more crops that we, about 5 focus crops, but in reality we grow 20 or so crops. So we decided we need to find a smaller number of crops that we could really focus on, that we were sure are high profit crops that we always had plenty of for our accounts. And we live in this barn house. I'm in the left section, just outside. You see the propagation house attached, and then we have a processing room and equipment storage and whatnot. And then we live in the other half of the building here. And there's the farm crew, the full-time workers and the part-time workers. And there's some of our staff who come and help us. And here's to manual work. Those of you who are working with your hands and have dirt underneath your fingernails, is the best kind of work. And you should be very proud of the work that you do. So kudos to you for making that happen. And there's a few other pictures of our farm. Try to make sure every square inch is used. And this is in the greenhouse. You can see no-till beds, fully composted. And when we use compost, I'm so excited about it because you can do more with it than you can with other forms of fertility, in my experience. And so Rachel, my wife here, is not a short person, almost 6 feet tall. And you can see there's kale that's just about, or maybe perhaps a bit taller than her. And we couldn't do this without no-till and without a composting method. And the lean idea here is that look how much kale is per square foot. And this is after what do you say, 20 or 30 harvests we've got just every week all year. This is a picture probably taken it's September or October, towards the end of the growing season, after we've already gotten lots of harvests off it. And so the idea is you can do more on a very tiny amount of land if you treat that land with respect. Okay, part one, I want to go over tools because it's important to have the right equipment to make this all work. And I'll go over process next, but first I wanted to show you the tools we use to do our soil building and composting. The principles are we want to choose just a few quality tools. And not surprisingly, the United Kingdom makes the best farm tools in the world, I think, especially your digging forks, and you'll see some UK tools here, and then root out the muri, or the waste or the muda of overburdening. So we want lightweight tools that remove effort. Lean is not anti-technology. That's a myth. Lean is about technology with a human face, technology that makes humans happy when they're using the tool because it removes burden from your work. Okay, so here's what we use for composting. First is a compost thermometer. You'll want to make sure it's at least 18 inches in length. You want to make sure that it will measure up to 141 degrees. Well, you would need a Celsius thermometer, of course, but 141 Fahrenheit is what we're aiming for here. And if you're moving large amounts of compost, if you have half an acre or more, then you will wear yourself out if you try to do a composting no-till type system exclusively by hand. And I know farmers who've tried, and we certainly have tried it, and once you get to more than half an acre, you really need something to help move that bulk compost, whether it's a bucket on a tractor or a skid loader, some type of option that lets you move it more mechanically. This is a version of a compost spreading implement that you can pull behind a tractor or even a gas-powered golf cart or a utility vehicle. And this will spread compost on your surface. It looks like a manure spreader, and it behaves like a manure spreader, but it spreads it out evenly instead of flinging your compost up going any direction. This is some similar tool designed by BCS, the Italian walk-behind tractor company. And it's designed to be pulled behind BCS, and that spreads compost evenly on your surface. And I actually show you these two tools, but we, to be honest, don't actually use these. We still, what I do is take my skid loader and spread the compost out on my plots, and we just use scoop shovels, aluminum scoop shovels and rakes to spread it, to thin it out by hand. However, this is another option for if you're probably doing a larger scale, perhaps even than we are. I tried to find a version in the United Kingdom and of that implement, and the best I could come up with was there are larger scale versions, but I really couldn't find a smaller scale one. So maybe those of you in the webinar here, if you want to type comments into the comment box, I'll be able to read them and suggest maybe there's a manufacturer making something along the lines of a small scale compost spreader in the United Kingdom. Another good option, and we certainly take advantage of two-wheel wheels here, especially if your bed width, the growing surface, can fit within the two wheel spacings here, then you can really move a lot of compost efficiently just with a wheel. And then once that compost is spread out, a bed rake, an Austrian bed rake like what you see here, is highly recommended. Johnny's Tools in the US sells a version of this, but this is, it's not a yard rake. It's designed to just skim the surface so that you're taking out any sticks or rocks that might plug up your seeder or transplanter that might be going into this soil surface. And then this is the classic broad fork. Wonderful to use with if you have a 5 or 6 year old kid who can stand on one end and give some extra weight to it. But to be honest, we only use that a broad fork ahead of carrots. For other crops, we don't need the soil to be loose more than a couple inches in depth. Okay, then we do have a small Kubota tractor and heavy clay soils in parts. And so a chisel plow implement behind a small tractor is, I think, recommended. I would recommend if you have very heavy soils ahead of your first year applying compost using this no-till method. And you can certainly hire out that work too. This is another implement that we use. We call it the undercutter. And the idea here is that you slice underneath. Okay, so I'm slicing underneath the lettuce here. And what that is doing is letting us rake up the lettuce and plant another crop without having to till. So I have it's the tip of a skid loader bucket. It's just a straight flat piece of metal that slices underneath and does a minimum amount of soil disturbance to get an old crop removed, even thickly sown lettuces like you see here. This is that tool in wheel hoe form. And so Haas, the H-O-S-S, the Haas company in the US sells a version of these sweeps. They're fixed blade sweeps. And the idea here is that you can slice underneath crops, just like that undercutter tool. And then we can rake up, remove those crops and plant another crop for a very quick transition from one crop to the next. We like a Zhang direct seeder. This is getting into later stages of production, but the Zhang seeder has those teeth on the front end that really can grip soils that have sticks in them, and it's a really durable tool that can handle chunkier compost. And here you see, there's a picture I took just a couple months ago. We did our first planting here. This is probably mid-February, and you can see the compost that we put on that compost probably in October. And you can see that there's sticks and leaves and chunks in it, and the Zhang seeder will be able to plow its way through. And I'm not a dogmatic person. Cedar is a very personal choice for a farmer. If you want to have a long conversation with farmers, ask them what their favorite cedar is. And so use your favorite cedar, but I'm showing you what's worked for us in this chunky compost. And then we used a paper pot transplanter tool. I won't necessarily have time to get into this tool here, but it also works pretty well with chunkier compost and works pretty well with the no-till system that we have. So let's move on to part 2, which is making compost. And midway through this part, I'll have a break and take some questions. And I'm gonna aim to stop talking at around 9 o'clock. And we'll leave some time then for questions too, so we can have some feedback, make sure you're getting all your questions answered. So making compost, there's 4 basic steps to this lean composting method. First is to gather your raw materials. And you want local raw materials, and a diverse mix is the best way to go here. And the idea here is that you are putting on a detective hat and finding what are the lowest cost sources of carbon close to my home. This is how humans have been growing food for 10,000 years. And it's actually a wonderful method that we have the advantage of. We don't have to move all these things by hand. We can rely on trucks and dump trucks and more efficient ways to get raw materials to our property. So I can't tell you for your particular farm what the best compost making ingredients are. Other than to say they should be close to home and they should be low cost. You can't afford to put a lot of money into compost, and that ideally you have a diverse mix of carbon-based materials. In other words, from something that was alive at one point. So these could be wood chips, leaf mold, hay, grass clippings, animal manures. It used to be said that you needed a 30-to-1 ratio of brown to green, of high carbon materials to high nitrogen materials, meaning manure would be a small proportion of what would go into your compost, because manure would be your higher nitrogen source of material, and then your leaves and hay and such would be your carbon. Now they're telling us that 30-to-1 ratio is not, the university studies show that's not that important. In fact, you could have a 2-to-1 ratio and still make good compost. And so I want to encourage you to not be too picky. We make compost out of spent grains from a beer brewing place here, out of wood chips, leaf mold, hay and grass, and all kinds of things. And it all makes good compost. The only difference is if you have obviously bigger particles such as in wood chips, then it's going to take you longer to make compost. The smaller size particles will break down faster. However, after 3 seasons, we've been able to make good compost even out of wood chips. Okay, number 2 is you mix all these ingredients and you build a heap. An ideal size heap for about a 1 acre plot of land is 9 feet in width, 6 feet in height, 50 feet in length. Okay, this gives you enough to skim coat ahead of planting for about an acre of land. If you have really poor soils, you're going to need maybe 3 or 4 times that amount in your first growing season as you build the organic matter up. However, in the long run, this is a manageable size heap. This isn't an overwhelming amount of organic matter for most farms to collect from, say 5 miles around your farm. And you basically want the largest size heap that you can make, because it's the core or the inner part of that heap where the composting activity is the greatest, okay? And I'll try to annotate here. This middle part is where all the action is. And the outer 12 inches here, there's not as much activity because it's too exposed to the elements. So this is where the thermophilic activity is. So you want big heaps, and you want to make sure that oxygen can get to the middle, because what happens is, imagine that there is a chimney out the top here. And what you're building is a big wood stove, and you have oxygen coming in, going in through the core, and then out the chimney, okay? And that is essentially the composting magic, is this transfer of oxygen, which is eaten up by your microbials in the heap, and heat is generated. That's why they call it a thermophilic process. Heat is generated, makes compost, and then heat escapes. And the more heat that's generated, the faster you can make compost. And hence, we're down to the third step here, which is turning the heap. We turn the heap for 2 reasons. First, it introduces even more oxygen into the heap. So I said you want porous materials. You want some, straw is a good one. Spent grains are good. You want some materials that allow oxygen naturally into the heap. If you just have leaves, for instance, it's too flat of a surface, and you won't have good oxygen entering in for this chimney effect. And so you want porous materials, but turning is another excellent way to get oxygen into your heap. So that's the first reason that we turn our heap. And the second is that it evens out the moisture level within the heap. And I'm going to talk about moisture and the importance of that in just a second. So in reality, the way we turn our heaps is that we take a skid loader here and we physically move the heap about 5 feet over from its current location, okay? And it takes me about 30 minutes to move one of those 50-foot heaps with a skid loader, so it's not an extravagant amount of time. And to get organic certification in the US, you need to turn your heaps 5 times. I know farmers who only turn heaps 2 times, and they say that they get good compost. So probably that's the range, 2 times to 5 times. However, you are going to need to homogenize your mix. To make it a more uniform mix, you'll probably need at least you'll need at least a couple of turns. Now, the next step is the one that's perhaps the most important and the one that's the most neglected. And that is to regulate 2 things, 2 conditions, your temperature and your moisture in your heap. So you need 15 days at 131 degrees Fahrenheit is the ideal for premium grade compost, okay? And the reason is, at that temperature, you kill the pathogens that might be in the heap, and you kill weed seeds that might be in the heap, okay? 15 days at 131 Fahrenheit, you have a nice sterile compost. Now, having said this, there are many in the composting community here who will contest that point and say you can do colder composting and still have wonderful compost. And I actually agree with them on some certain conditions. Cold composting is wonderful if you know that your ingredients do not have weed seeds in them. If you have any suspicion there's weed seeds in your heap, then you're going to want a hot heap to kill them. And so you don't, it takes a lot of work to get it up to 131 Fahrenheit. As you turn it, there's two ways to heat your heaps. First is turning the heap, and second is adding manure or fresh nitrogen to the heap. Those are the two easiest ways to accelerate the heat. So there's input involved with getting it that hot. And if you don't have to do that, then you might as well skip that step. Okay, so second point in number 4 here is regulating the moisture level in your heap. And the idea here is that in the summertime, we actually water our heap just like we water our crops. I'll sometimes put automated sprinklers on top of the heap. Sometimes we'll water by hand because you have little animals, microbials in there doing your work, and you don't want them to die of thirst. Okay, you're an animal farmer. You have to put on your hat a bit as an animal farmer here. And then alternatively, in the winter, you don't want to overly saturate your heap. You don't want to drown those microbials. So you want the right amount of moisture in your heap. You should be able to stick your hand there, pick it up, squeeze it, and a little bit of water comes out with a really tight squeeze. It's kind of the farmer way of knowing that you've got the right amount of moisture in your heap. Okay, so I'll show you some pictures of this in process quick. There's about 50 yards a year that we have delivered to our property here. Leaves, grass clippings. Our neighbors bring kitchen scraps over. We collect duck manure, spent grains. You see wood chips, you see leaf mulch on the right-hand side. There's a florist who drops off some greens kind of in the middle there too. There's another image. You can see quite large chunks and some more broken down pieces. And then you see I have a sign on the far left. It says finished compost. And so we make our heaps 1 year in advance. So for this season, I'm making what will be used next growing season. And I see that I'm going to try to erase my earlier drawings here. Okay. And here's a picture of one of our heaps that 9 feet in width, 6 feet in height, 50 feet in length. And I will make my son move before I get on the skid loader and move the heap. However, what I'm going to do is simply move that heap from where it is to about where my son is standing. And then watering that heap in the summertime, very important. You can see there are chunks and sticks and such, and this is about ready to use. I'm not perfectionistic in my compost making. I don't need potting mix grade compost. It'll continue to decompose after I apply it to the soil. The main thing is it broken down enough that I can transplant into it or direct seed into it? Here we have Rachel covering the heap. We use a product called Compost-Tex. And Compost-Tex is a fabric designed just well, sorry, I lost my mouse. It's a fabric that's designed just specifically for making compost. Well, I'm trying to do fancy things like type, and now my mouse is gone. So give me a second to work on the technology here. So while I'm messing around, maybe Sarah, can you see the questions? I can't. We could break and people could ask some questions, and I will continue to try to get my mouse back in order here.
Yeah, sure, Ben. So Kate saying, hi, Ben, I live in Carnarvon. So she's Northwest Wales, and I'm just starting a large veg plot, which is no-till and organic. I have a wood stove, which creates a large amount of ash, just wood. What's the best way of using it, please? Spread directly on the soil or incorporate in my compost. Also, I have a lot of bracken and foxglove digitalis growing on my land. Could I use these in the compost? Some say yes, some say no. Thank you, Kate.
Anything that was once living can be made into compost. Okay. And so I would say yes to all of that. The factor is that it might take you longer time to get all those materials fully decomposed, especially the woodier materials. Okay. As far as the ash, ash is lime, and there are farmers who have pH problems, and if you need to adjust your pH, then adding ash is a wonderful way to do it. If you don't, then I would recommend adding adding ash directly to the soil. If you don't need to do a pH adjustment, then by all means, add it to your compost. And that's a wonderful solution. And we do that we have a wood stove too, and we add lots of ash to our compost from the wood stove. Okay, any other questions?
Sorry, this is from Chris Boyle. Do you have any experience with barrel composting machines like the rocket composter?
You know, I don't, in part because I should say I tried it one summer, but our scale of our operation, the amount of compost we need was just too much, and turned out to be too much work. So to be quite honest, it's just easiest for us to collect the raw materials and put it into a big heap, and rather than deal with any other input. So we're looking for the simplest possible method, and that's what we came up with.
Lovely. Let me see.
So Sarah, what I'm going to do is try to join from another laptop. I think my screen is frozen or something. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
On this one here. So I might have to log out and log back in, but why don't you go ahead and ask another question while I get my other laptop.
Okay, fine. Some people advise that over 60C fries some bugs. Please comment.
I agree with that. And that's one reason that I actually prefer cold composting. I prefer to get raw materials that do not have weed seeds in them. And then it's, number one, a quicker composting process. I don't have to worry about achieving those high temperatures. And number two, we preserve some of the beneficial microbials that might be killed through that heating up to such a high temperature. So really what I look for in when I know my compost is finished is not the amount of heat I've generated, but the texture. Is it a friable mix that I can transplant crops into?
Jilly is asking, have you looked into using biochar?
Yeah, I have. And biochar is a wonderful option, and it takes a longer time to do. However, if you have access to woody materials for making biochar, I do recommend that you look into it. I don't have access to the woody materials. We have some wood chips available to us, but and again, I would stress that I would experiment with these practices for a season or two. And the reality is you can spend lots and lots of time and money making compost, and you want to find a simple process because you need to spend time planting food, harvesting food, and delivering it if you're going to make a living at this. And so I'm not opposed to biochar. I'm not dogmatic about any of these composting processes. And certainly look into it if you have, wood chips or the woody material of it.
Lovely. Thanks, Ben. Rachel's asking, does it have to be covered?
It does not have to be covered. It depends. The reason we are covering is that you can see Rachel covering it here going into the winter. We'll have 10, 12 inches of snow, and you do not want 12 inches of snow melting into your compost heap. It'll oversaturate your heap, at least here in our weather conditions. And then the summertime, it does not rain enough. It's too hot. And so, like I said, we will slow down the composting activity because we don't have enough moisture in the heap unless we cover it. Covering in the summer helps maintain moisture in there. So you cover for those specific reasons. Okay, any other questions?
Joey is saying, can you recap on the porous materials to add again, please?
Good question. And the best of the best is straw. Straw. And the reason is straw is hollow in the middle. Okay, especially oat straw. Very hollow, or wheat straw, I mean, very hollow in the middle, and air gets in your heap very nicely. Spent grains, barley grains from breweries or distilleries, those are excellent for adding porosity to your heap. And then we do add some wood chips to our heap, and wood chips add some porosity too. So really you're looking at a physical texture of the material. It's not about the mineral content or fertility of it, but the physical texture.
Great. Couple more.
Okay.
Kate is saying, are there any regulations about waste handling and drainage in the USA? It's quite strictly controlled in the UK.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. At this point, there are some, but it's not nearly as strict. And it's mostly the regulations are geared towards the mega farms. They don't want you to have 2 acres of manure heaped up. And so for smaller producers, it's not very well regulated. So the thing that we do, however, is make sure that wherever you're sitting your compost, that it is sitting in a place that it drains, especially if you're using fresh manures, that's not draining into your rivers, and it's not draining directly onto plots if you have leafy greens. So be sensible about your placement, and be mindful of where the runoff, the rainwater runoff is going to head.
Do you analyze the nutrients in the compost to ensure that all elements and minerals are available?
I don't. And part of the reason is that I'm fundamentally a lazy person, and I just haven't found that I need to. I'm not necessarily recommending that. What I did was when we started getting into this compost process about 5 years ago, I'd sent some into a lab to get tested. And it was good compost, and it grew great crops. And so I don't see a need to spend money. It's about $200, it's fairly expensive to get a full compost analysis. It's more expensive than a standard soil test. And so we did a one-time test about 5 seasons ago and have been using about the same recipe since. I want to talk, if you can see my screen here, I want to keep moving ahead, and then I'll open up again for more questions.
Great.
There are 2 types of compost that I recommend keeping. One would be a high carbon compost, which would be your leaves, grass, moldy hay. Another, preserve some high nitrogen. Just keep your poultry manure aside. You can buy dehydrated manure pellets here in the US. And because when you have generative crops, tomatoes and peppers, these are crops where you're harvesting the fruits. And so you don't want actually too much nitrogen given to those crops. Does that make sense? Because when you give too much nitrogen to a crop, then you have really leafy peppers and tomatoes, aphids attack them, and you have small size fruits. Now, on the other hand, we have vegetative crops, kale, spinach, swish, or that sort of thing. And those crops we're harvesting the leaf portion. And on those, they do benefit from extra nitrogen. And so you see back here, we have leafy greens. Sarah, can you see the screen here? And can you hear me?
Yes,
Everything?
fine.
So you see I have what I call a brown compost and a black compost. And the brown compost would be the manure-based high nitrogen compost. And then the black compost has very little of the manure in it. So when I go to plant a leafy green crop, I'll use more of the brown compost. I'll skim coat with the brown compost, and then you get faster growth on the greens and nicer leafy greens. You can see 2 colors of heaps here, the front being the brown compost and the back being the black or the high carbon type compost. And so this is what you get. You get big rhubarb plants, big head lettuce, if you can apply that higher nitrogen with more manure base in your compost. We're not in the US allowed to use fresh manures on our crops, but if we can compost them for a 3 months, 90-day period, then we're able to use them. And our kids love that stuff too. Okay, so I wanted to get into the, what do we do with our compost after it's made? And I will come back to your questions too on making compost if you still have them. a bit of theory behind why this no-till stuff is so popular. It's how we've been growing food for thousands of years. You see how the ancient Japanese in 927 were growing spring onions. They needed 1,200 seedlings, a day and a half, an oxen and driver, a day for hand tillage, 2 days to form some ridges, and then 35 days to transport 210 loads of manure. Holy cow. So out of about 90 days work, almost half of them, 35 days, are devoted to composting. Okay, to grow coriander, same thing. Out of 28 days work, almost all of them, 22 days, are spent moving manures. And thank goodness we don't have to move all these things by hands with baskets on our heads. We have more efficient ways of moving these raw materials. But let's just say that before the railroads were introduced in the United States and Canada, for instance, it's a similar process. It's only when it became cheap to ship other fertility sources to farms that we moved away from this process. Now, the idea here behind not tilling is that there's a lot of good stuff happening underneath the surface. You have bacteria, worms, beetles, earthworms, protozoa, fungi, and all kinds of microorganisms that are doing important work, converting nitrogen into usable forms, increasing soil porosity, making minerals available. Look at the size of the worm that we pull out of our soil here. And this is a wonderful picture that I like from the Atlantic magazine. And it shows you just going to focus on the fungi, just the fungus, the networks of fungus in the soil. And look at the symbiotic relationships. The mycorrhizae is any fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. Okay, imagine those plant roots without the fungus around them. Okay, this is a fungus provides support. I've read that nutrient availability can increase by 100 times because of the fungal networks that you preserve. And I need to plug in my laptop for 1 second so that we don't lose the image here. Okay, and then on the opposite of preservation of those soils is tilling. So anytime we plow or fork or tilth or power harrow or rake, we decimate what's called the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is that area, any soil that comes in contact with roots or the rhizomes is called the rhizosphere. So we want to preserve that rhizosphere as much as we can. And when you leave ground sit, that starves the fungi in the rhizosphere, and you don't have those benefits going to your plant. Okay, and so the last section on the theory part here, let's dissect what is healthy organic soil. It's basically just 3 parts. First, you have to have good tilth or good structure to your soil. You want that cake-like feel. It's loose enough for plants, and you can work it too to get your transplants put in. Number 2, you want that biological activity that I just got done talking about in the rhizosphere. And third, you do need a chemical balance. You don't want too much nitrogen, too many other minerals, and a relative balance is needed. However, what happens is that I've seen many farmers are stuck on the chemistry piece, taking soil tests and amendments, and nature has a way of balancing out the chemistry if you're adding enough carbon and doing this no-till process. So I don't think that you need to get overly stuck on soil tests before every crop that you plant. Soil is more than a math problem. It's really a biology experiment. And so I lean heavily on the side of saying, let's keep biological activities alive. Let's use natural processes and try to mimic as closely as we can growing our food in the way that nature grows food. So nature doesn't have plows out there tilling. Nature relies on softer processes through slow decomposition of leaves on the soil surface, and then annual seeds will grow into that, for example. Okay, so no-till bed preparation. This is what it looks like. I'm gonna skip ahead to say what I call is a 3-step mulch in place field management. And mulch in place is a type of no-till. I prefer to use I like mulch in place because it's positive. It says what we are doing instead of what we're not doing. Okay, we're not tilling, but just because you don't till doesn't mean you'll have healthy soils. So what we do is, number one, pull out the old crop. Number two, we'll loosen the bed if needed. For example, a head of carrots. And then we're gonna add 1/2 inch to 2 inches of compost. We'll leave it on the surface. Okay, in the turnover time, it just takes about 30 minutes. I'll show you some pictures so you get a very clear sense for what this feels like. So here we have a bed of arugula that we let freeze over the winter. And so I didn't even pull out the old arugula. And I'm going to put compost directly on the surface with a skid loader. And then we're going to just smooth out that compost on the surface. So it's a very thin layer cake. It looks like it's thick here, but it's really just a thin layer of compost on the surface. We'll use it like a mulch. And that's why we call it mulch in place. And so a good option, like I'd said, is to add more, up to 6 or 8 inches even if you need to, if you have really poor, heavily compacted, heavy clay or pure sand type of soils. And then the major thing here is leave that stuff on the surface. Do not till it in. When you till in, you destroy the rhizosphere. And when you leave it on the surface, then every time that rains come, you have a natural drip, 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 a slow compost tea feeding fertility down to your plant roots. And leaving it on the surface also helps to kill the weeds. So I showed this I showed you this video earlier, but yeah, now I'm getting a balloon. Well, I apologize for all the technology snafus here. We're in a heavy rainstorm, and I'll bet it's affecting my internet connection. And what I'm going to do is just start it over.
Shall I? Can you manage to do another question, Ben, while you're doing it?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sarah says, hi, I'm a poultry producer in Wales with about 8 tons of manure a week. Can this be made into good compost with the addition of other products as straw, etc., or is it better to stick to fertilizer production?
Okay, so you can make compost out of manures, and you'll have a very high nitrogen compost. However, the best compost will be made if you add at least 2 parts of a carbonous material to your 1 part of manure. Okay, and ideally, like I said, they recommend up to 30 parts carbon to 1 part manure. Does that answer your question? I'm showing you some more pictures of laying this compost directly on the surface and then leaving it. Yeah, go ahead.
Shall I ask another one? Nikki says, instead of a long, low heap, can a tall, contained heap work? Also, should sides of a container be open for oxygen?
Okay, could you ask the first half of that question?
Instead of a long, low heap, can a tall, contained heap work?
The challenge with a tall heap is simply getting to it. So really the size of the heap, you want it to be as ergonomic as possible. And so 6 feet in height is about the height that a skid loader bucket can dump. And that's why a lot of people choose that height. If you have a 12-foot high heap, then you've got some problems getting to it unless you've got a way to get up that high. So I guess I don't necessarily recommend going higher than 6 feet. And really, you can have large round heaps. That's fine too, because you want the large core in the middle. Like I said, that's where the thermophilic activity is. But with a really large round heap, then you have a problem of moving it. So the longer windrows and taller windrows is really, I think, the way to go in terms of being a size that you can manage and being easy enough to move. So I'm just scrolling through pictures here of this same process. In the greenhouse, we'll do the same. And in the winter time, when the ground is frozen, is my favorite time to apply compost directly onto the surface, because then there's 0 soil compaction. I understand it's probably not an option in your location. Go ahead and ask another question.
Daniel says, hi Ben, I have a small compost bin that we put grass and food waste in. We had a large outbreak of maggots. How can this be avoided?
Oh, okay. Yeah, probably I'm guessing you had probably too many vegetable scraps in the heap, in that it became compacted and then it became very moist. And that's what maggots absolutely love. So to avoid it, you need a looser heap and you need more carbonous materials in the heap.
Thank you.
I get asked about what to do with brand new plots. And so I'll show you some images of a totally brand new plot. We just have a truck come and dump compost directly on the surface and then grow directly into it. But you might need to plow first. And so I know that plowing is not a no-till practice, but on the very first step in soil preparation on heavily compacted land or pastures, and plowing is sometimes needed. I'm sorry, Sarah, you're about to ask another question.
There's one more, I think. Bear with me. Oh, James is asking, why use a broad fork? Surely that will damage the fungi.
And so, like I said, my preference is to not actually use broad forks or any soil loosening, except ahead of carrots. And the reason is that we have customers who want these absurdly long, 10 and 12-inch long, perfectly straight carrots. And we've found that a bit of broad forking ahead of carrots does help, okay? And otherwise, the crops you're looking at here were not broad forked. Soil's natural condition is firm, okay? It's not loose. It's humans that we seem to like a really loose soil structure. It just feels better to us. But actually, if you walk around in the woods, you see soils that are firm, and you see lots of plants growing into soils that are firm. And a lot of crops like the lettuce and the green beans you're looking at here, they only need a couple inches of soil to be loose enough just so that you can get the transplant in. And otherwise, those roots don't penetrate much deeper than top couple inches, and they can get all the nutrients they need in there. But that's a good question. I want to recap some of the benefits here. Is there are fewer weeds. I didn't really emphasize this enough, but when you till more than 2 inches in depth, you're bringing weed seeds up to the surface. If you can avoid tilling below 2 inches, then those weed seeds stay underneath the surface. And so after a few seasons, you can have a virtually weed-free organic farm. And I can attest to that as being the truth. And it's really a wonderful pleasure to be able to farm without having to deal with weeds. Now, the birds will always bring some weeds in. The wind will drip some weeds in. I don't think there's a way to achieve perfection here. However, we have dramatically fewer weeds than when we were using our heavier tillage process. I want to emphasize this one too, because I'm all about lean stuff. It's less work to do this method in the long run than it is to plant cover crops and till in those cover crops. It's just fewer steps. You're just simply pulling an old crop, adding a bit of mulch, and planting another crop. It's a slow release form of fertility because every time it rains, your plants get minerals, and then you have an increased what they call cation exchange capacity. In other words, your soil is going to hold minerals for a longer period of time. And they're telling us now that up to 9 years, soil can hold minerals for 9 years after your initial compost application. So let's take a couple more questions here if you have any.
Chris is asking, he says, I grow lettuce hydroponically, so I have a lot of leafy waste as well as root balls to compost. I find it very wet and compost heaps don't get very hot. Should I add sawdust, straw, wood chip, etc.?
Yeah, it would be very hard with just leafy greens to make a good compost. You're going to need more diversity in the mix. And probably the best would be those items you just listed, especially if you have some leaves and straw. Those two added to your leafy greens would make a wonderful compost. And manures will help to burn it up too. If you're seeing that the particle sizes aren't shrinking down to the size you want, adding fresh manure to a compost heap is the best way to really jumpstart that process.
Gwyndaf, do you need irrigation for summer cropping?
I do in my location, but I need far, far less after having moved to this no-till method, mulch in place method, because of the increased moisture holding capacity that the soil has. Now, ironically, at the same time, I have longer workability windows in my soil too. So it holds more moisture for the plant roots. However, in that top couple inches, even after a heavy rain, oftentimes after a couple of hours, even after heavy rain, I can get out and plant. I direct seeded carrots yesterday afternoon and it rained in the morning. And I could not have done that on our clay soils without leaving carbon to decompose on the soil surface. I wanted to show a couple of alternatives, show what some other farmers are doing, alternative no-till methods, just out of curiosity to pique your interest, because I'm not dogmatic, there are lots of ways of going about this. The main thing is to get carbon onto the soil surface and let it decompose on the surface and to grow into it. So there are some creative ways of doing this. Okay, this is called in-situ composting, and this is actually our farm here. And what I did at the city, I called this city that we live close to, and said, hey, could you bring out, say 50 trucks of leaves? And this is 2 years ago in October when all the leaves were falling from the trees. So they brought out these leaves and just dumped them on the soil, on the surface. And I spread them out with my skid loader. And you can see here a pile of leaves that is basically one big horizontal compost heap that the leaves are about 12 inches at least thick in some places. And then I evened them out with a tiller here, but I didn't till them in. I kept that tiller high enough that I kept them on the surface. And then I did nothing. Okay, I waited. And then 8 months later, those leaves had broken down to the point where I could just get my transplanter, that Japanese paper pot transplanter tool, to go through them and transplant my lettuce. And I had the most wonderful lettuce crop I've ever had. And a weed-free surface and a very low labor method. And I plan to keep on doing this as we build new plots. We have the leaves available for free, and there's just virtually no labor involved, and it's a great way to jumpstart a garden. A friend of mine up in Maine does the same process, except instead of getting leaves hauled to his property, he grows the carbon. So here he's growing, I believe this is alfalfa and rye. And what he's going to do is sow these crops at the end of the growing season. And here he's watering and irrigating and weeding them. And then he's going to knock them down. They've got this, this is just a piece of wood, 2x6, a couple handles, and 2 of them can knock it over. You can certainly get implements that do this too. The Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania here has designed a cover crop crimping tool that farmers in our area in Indiana will use this crimping tool to crimp or knock down your carbon source if you're growing your own. Because this is what to do if you don't have free or cheap sources of carbon that you can have hauled to your property. You can grow your own. And then what they do at Frith Farm in Maine is they're covering it with a tarp after they've crimped. So if you use this crimper here, it'll probably kill it sufficiently that you don't have to cover it. If you're just going to knock it over by hand, you're going to need to do a bit more to kill it. So they're going to cover it with a tarp. And then a week and a half, they're going to uncover this. Now this is in the summertime when it's going to really bake and really cook pretty quickly underneath. They're going to uncover that tarp and transplant some fall brassica crops into it. So wonderful creative process, creative way to get a carbon on and leave it on the soil surface. They're not tilling it in or plowing it in the way that most places will recommend you treat your cover crops. You just leave that cover crop on the surface. Okay, let's open it up for some more questions. Okay, I'm gonna scroll through some extra images just showing you how we're growing food in this compost-based system, and then we'll close up here in about in a few minutes. So the baby greens, you can see the mix of greens we grow. Spinach being, for the most part, what we do in the winter. And we're gonna direct seed into our compost. And you can see there's sticks and chunks in here. but with the Jane cedar, it just plows right through, and we're gonna get pretty good germination. And in the summer months, we actually use a shade cloth and cover those greens because it gets too hot for the cool season crops. But our restaurants still want to have those specialty cut greens in the summer. And even in the greenhouses between the rows of tomatoes, we'll tuck in some greens quick and grow those in the springtime. Okay, so tomatoes are going in at that transition between the winter crop and the tomatoes going in is a good time to add more compost. And with tomatoes, I'm a bit more specific with placing compost. And I grow these on just shallow hills, and then we'll put a divot in the hill, put compost in that divot. And that's our fertility source for the tomatoes. Carrots, we will do the same, seed those directly into compost and get wonderful size on carrots. And then I have that same tool that I use to remove the lettuces, this undercutter tool, that I can slice underneath the carrots to help aid in the harvesting of carrots. And then that's, this is the tool we use for washing carrots. And I'm getting the balloon again. I think we got just a poor internet connection, but that's about the end of my images here. Does anyone have further questions? And we'll close up.
We've got one from Rihanna on Ben. With the compost temperatures, do you need to keep the heat at 131 Fahrenheit for the 15 days in a row? Is this the temperature at the center of the heap? Does this kill seeds at the edges of the heap? And do you need to achieve this with every turn of the heap?
Okay, I like those questions. So 131 Fahrenheit, that's why you need that 18-inch thermometer, compost thermometer, so you can measure into the middle of your heaps. Because no, on the outer edges of your heap, you will not achieve 131 Fahrenheit. And that's the reason for organic certification here. They require you to turn your heap so that you know that every particle in that compost at some point has revolved its way into the middle of the heap, if that makes sense. So that every particle has achieved 131 Fahrenheit. So yes, you do probably need to turn to make sure you get uniform heat throughout your compost heap. Was there a second half to that question?
Did you answer that? Does it kill seeds at the edges of the heap? Do you need to achieve this with every turn? I think you answered it all.
Yeah, you don't need to achieve 131 with every turn. You need to achieve it over a 15-day consecutive time. And so you might need to turn on a daily basis through those 15 days if you need to keep jumping up the heat, or maybe just one turn and it'll maintain itself at 131 for a 15-day period. So that's where you have your thermometer and you go out and check. And if you're not hitting the 131 mark, like I said, your best two options are to turn the heap or to add fresh manure to the heap.
Thank you. Tim is asking, do you not compact soil whilst harvesting, etc., picking beans daily, and so have to till periodically?
You know, there is compaction that happens. And I'm not as particular as some. I walk on the bed surface. However, I'm not stupid. So after a rain, well, my wife might disagree with that on some things, but I'm stupid about a lot of things. But I'm not stupid about when I walk on the soil. If it's rained a lot, I'm not going to go out and walk directly on a really wet soil. And in the wintertime, if it's frozen, I feel free to drive equipment over soils. So just be smart about when you're walking on your soils. And so, yeah, there is some compaction that happens. But if you're adding a bit of compost every season, and just by, like, let's take example of the kale that you're looking at here. When we harvest that kale, we're going to pull it up by the roots. And just by the act of pulling up the kale, that soil stays fairly loose. And then what I'll do is pull off that tarp and just seed my next crop into it without a need to broad fork. Now, I said I don't broad fork except a head of carrots, but I do actually, that's not quite true. I do keep a broad fork. I use a broad fork as a check. I should be able to basically fling that broad fork in, and it should penetrate fairly easily, about 3 to 4 inches of depth okay, or a digging fork. So what I'll do sometimes, like after the kale comes up here, and I suspect we're overly compacted, I'll just take a digging fork and I'll drop the digging fork. So I'll back up and see what I'm doing. Just drop that digging fork and make sure it can penetrate 3 or 4 inches deep. And then I know it's loose enough for crops. And 90% of the time, I'll tell you it is loose enough. It just stays loose enough in our conditions with enough compost. And if it isn't, then we will bring out some broad forks and do a bit of soil loosening. I'm gonna scroll through some more images and you can keep asking questions.
Okay, Lynn is asking, do you get slugs living in the mulch?
I know that was a constant theme when I was in the United Kingdom was slugs. You must have a lot of them. And to be honest, I did have some slugs when I did that mulch, when I did that in situ composting, where I just had the leaves spread 12 inches thick on the surface, and they really did get in there. And I dealt with it. I have a Sluggo product. It's the brand name of it, Sluggo. And one application of that Sluggo, it's an organic product that takes care of the slugs, and that worked for me. But after that, as leaves had decomposed, we haven't seen the slugs return. So I'll be honest that we just do not have a lot of slug pressure here, and that might be an issue. That may be more of an issue in the United Kingdom. You might need to make sure your composts are more broken down before you apply them, because that's what slugs love, is they love to help in the late stages of composting when you have leaves that are wet and matted on top of one another. Slugs are just saying, hey, we're here to help. We're gonna do our part, but you actually don't want them to do their part because you have crops in the ground. So that's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but generally a drier compost and a more well decomposed compost will have fewer slugs.
Bob is asking, when do you remove the plastic sheet mulch? Is the crop removed through it at the end? And how do you prevent plastic fibers getting into your soil?
Okay, so in this case here, this is landscaping fabric. So it's not technically 1 millimeter thick plastic, which I prefer to use landscaping fabric because we're trying to minimize the use of single-use plastics on our farm. In other words, plastics that we use one time and then throw away at the end of the growing season. And this fabric I've been able to use for 9 growing seasons. And what I'll do is after the kale is finished here, we'll pull it up by the roots, and I'll be, I'm a little sheepish to admit it. However, what we're doing is we're planting kale in the same place the next growing season. Okay, so not rotating kale crops, just planting another round of kale in here because the tarps are already here and the drip tape is already in place. And so you're the first group I've admitted this to, so you can't spread it very far. But we're not doing the crop rotation we're technically supposed to. However, I'll tell you that this is you're looking at the second year kale's been in this location. And it looks like we got a healthy, crop. However, what I did do is I did add a bit of high nitrogen compost in the holes when we transplanted kale. So I sort of remineralized the hole as I transplanted, and that seems to help.
Gwyndaf, how do you keep cabbage white butterfly from your brassicas?
Yeah, BT. I simply have to spray on a weekly basis. There's just no way around it.
131 degrees Fahrenheit or centigrade?
That's a Fahrenheit. And I'm sorry, I don't have the translation in my head.
With the tarp, do you get problems with pests like rats, from Rachel?
Okay, could you repeat the question?
Sorry, with the tarpaulin, do you get problems with pests like rats?
I've not had rats. We will have moles that will occasionally like to burrow their way in under the tarps in the winter months. And we have some mole traps that take care of the moles, but rats and mice I don't have.
I think that's all the questions, Ben. I'll just
Okay.
double check in the... Oh, somebody's worked out the conversion. It's 55 degrees centigrade.
Okay, that's what I had in my mind, is in that 55 to 60 neighborhood. So,
Yeah, I think that's all questions finished.
okay, thank you very much. It's been a great session, and hopefully you can go away with some ideas you can start to use this growing season. And do take care. This is our chance with this pandemic. This is our chance as small farmers to really show our communities that we're with them, that we care. And in pandemics, there tends to be a degradation of trust. People don't necessarily trust the food system in the US. We've seen grocery store shelves emptying out. And this is our chance to say, hey, we're local farmers here. You can trust us. You can trust our food. And we're here to make that human connection. And we care about our communities in this time. And so kudos to you for sticking with it, staying, growing food through this pandemic, and playing a very important part in your community. So thank you again for having me, and keep up the work.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much, Ben. That was absolutely brilliant, and such great questions from all the everybody who's joined us. Made it really interactive. So super, really good. Thank you again. Just to let you know before you depart, the webinar's been recorded, and that will be available on our Tyfu Cymru Knowledge Hub on the website. When you leave the webinar, there's a very short evaluation sheet which will pop up automatically. If you have got a chance to answer that, that would be very helpful to us to continue our training and see where you want us to go next. And, you know, get in touch. All the information's on the website if you've got specific requests. So I'll just finish off by saying thanks again to Ben. That was absolutely brilliant.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.